The identification of the sword of Goliath and of David and of Laban provides additional meaning to two separate but related scriptural stories, the beheadings of Goliath and Laban. Both Goliath and Laban were not simply slain, they were beheaded with their own swords. In Goliath's case, David took Goliath's head back as a trophy of war. In both cases, the sword and armor of the vanquished enemy was appropriated. The beheadings in both cases were extraordinary actions and from a certain point of view unnecessary. David had already stunned or killed Goliath with his sling. All that was needed was to finish the deed by stabbing the giant. Beheading was dramatic, to be sure, causing the Philistine army to flee, but they likely would have fled anyway because their champion had been defeated. Nephi didn't have to kill Laban, let alone behead him. Laban was in a drunken stupor laying in the street. Nephi could have stripped Laban and left. Laban was in no condition to stop Nephi. So why did David and Nephi behead Goliath and Laban? The overt explanation for the beheadings is simple. David and Nephi were acting at the command of Jesus Christ. The Lord demanded the beheadings in both cases. David said as much when he set forth to battle Goliath. He promised to kill and behead the giant in the name of the Lord. The Lord had promised David he would deliver the Philistine into his hands. The reason for the execution, for that is what it was Goliath's open defiance of the Lord. The giant not only verbally threatened Israel, he had taken its sword of state. He was prepared to use the sword against the kingdom it represented, the kingdom of God on earth. It was a crime that demanded the death penalty. The beheading of Laban was another ritual execution at the command of the Lord. The Spirit constrained Nephi 3 times to kill Laban, explaining that the Lord had delivered him for this purpose. Though Nephi was reluctant, he finally obeyed the Spirit and decapitated Laban. The reason given for the execution was the need to procure the brass plates. Nephi could have obtained the plates without beheading Laban. Still, a beheading was required. Laban merited beheading by stealing the state sword and defying the rightful king of the kingdom of God on earth. But there is more to the stories than examples of ritual execution for crimes against the state. Both stories serve a deeper purpose, the fulfillment of the ancient and planetary archetype of the combat between the warrior hero and the giant or monster. Myths and legends of the ancient world recount numerous tales of a hero, often a strapping youth, who fights and kills a monster or giant threatening the kingdom or the entire world. In many of the stories, the hero decapitates the giant. The most famous classical example is that of Perseus killing the Gorgon Medusa. Perseus, at the behest of the gods, sought out and killed the mortal Gorgon Medusa. He did so with a magical sickle given him by the god Hermes. Like David standing over the inert body of Goliath and Nephi standing over the drunken Laban, Perseus stood over the sleeping Medusa and then cut off her head. And like David, Perseus took the head as a gift to a god. When Perseus set out to kill the Gorgon, he was given the cap of Hades. This cap gave the youth the ability of invisibility. When wearing it, he could not be seen by anyone. The armor of Laban gave Nephi a similar ability. After he had donned Laban's armor and sword, he went to see Laban's servant, Zoram. Zoram was unable to recognize Nephi even when Nephi spoke to him. While it was dark, Zoram should have easily recognized his master. Clearly, Nephi was assisted with a power to mask his identity. According to the account of Geoffrey of Monmouth, King Arthur saved his kingdom from the threat of a giant of monstrous size. Arthur fought the giant with his legendary sword Excalibur. Arthur did not initially kill the giant, but like the story of David and Goliath, he stunned the giant with a wound to the forehead. With the giant debilitated, Arthur commanded that he be beheaded and his head taken back to camp for public view. It is an almost exact duplicate of the story of David and Goliath. Arthur was not the only giant killer in his kingdom. Jack, known as the Giant Killer, lived during the reign of King Arthur. In one of Jack's exploits, he beheads the two-headed giant Thunderdell. In another adventure, Jack decapitates the giant Galligantus. Jack is assisted by the familiar gifts, a magical sword and a cloak of invisibility. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh relates how the hero, Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, and Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods, together defeat and slay Humbaba, a monstrous giant raised by Utu, the sun. The heroes kill the giant by decapitating him, and bring back his head as a gift for the god Enlil. The Old English hero Beowulf kills and then beheads the giant monster Grendel. He does so with a special antique sword. Tales of a young hero slaying a monstrous giant by decapitation are numerous in the mythologies of the ancient world. Like all mythic figures, the hero as giant killer is an archetype based upon the planets of the polar configuration. In previous episodes, we have identified the planet Mars as the basis for the warrior hero archetype. The red planet is Apollyon and Michael the Dragon Slayer of Revelation. Mars became the archetype for the giant as well. Martian heroes were often said to be shapeshifters. At times they were small dwarves, while at other times they grew in size to become awe-inspiring giants. The Egyptian Bes, the Indian Hanuman, the Finnish Sampsa, and the Polynesian Maui, and many others were Martian heroes and shapeshifters. The ability of the Martian hero to change size becomes readily understandable when its planetary origin is unmasked. The planet Mars itself was a shapeshifter, alternating in size from the point of view of ancient mankind. As the planet ascended the polar column, it became smaller and smaller until it was a small circle within the larger orb of Venus. When the planet descended down the column, it became larger and larger, assuming gigantic proportions as it filled the horizon. The giants beheaded by the mythic warrior hero were deformed monsters threatening the natural order. The warrior hero could assume gigantic proportions himself, but the giants he faced as a youth were his alter egos. The planetary archetype was the same for hero and giant, generating two mythic aspects, one heroic and the other demonic. The splitting of personal aspect, one good and the other evil, is quite common in myth. It is a form of mythic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The beheading of the giant was a series of events involving Mars and other aspects of the polar configuration. The giant in this case was the Heaven Man, or the Pillar God. The axis mundi, or world mountain, formed the torso or body of the giant. Mars became its head. The crescent on Saturn, generated by the light of the sun, became the upraised arms of this gigantic human form. The crescent also represented a sickle or saber, which, due to the rotation of the Earth in its daily cycle, appeared to revolve around Venus, positioned above Mars and the axis mundi. As the crescent rotated, it was seen to pass through the torso of the Heaven Man. The sword was, in effect, severing the head of the giant from its body. When Mars descended to the Earth, the severed head of the giant fell to the ground. Alternatively, the sword used to behead the giant Heaven Man was a long sword like Arthur's Excalibur. The blade of the sword was the axis mundi, and the hilt was the Saturnian crescent. In the story of David and Goliath, David took the head of the giant to Jerusalem as a trophy. The heavenly archetype accounts for David's action. When Mars reascended to its original position nested within the orbs of Venus and Saturn, it returned to the heavenly city, also called Jerusalem, or in John's Apocalypse, the New Jerusalem. This aspect of the planetary story also explains Perseus giving the head of Medusa to Athena, the Greek version of the Roman Venus. David's slaying of Goliath with a sling, or at least stunning the giant, incorporates another important event in the history of the polar configuration. The decapitation of the giant is preceded by a blow to the forehead, causing a near-fatal wound. The wound was caused by a stone slung by the hero David. The giant of Mount St. Michael was wounded in the forehead by Arthur with Excalibur. The motif of a wound to the forehead of a giant or the hero himself, since they are alter egos of each other, is found throughout the mythologies of the world. As we noted, the head of the giant and of the hero was the planet Mars. The blow that struck the hero and giant, leaving a scar, is the mythic articulation of a blow that struck the planet Mars, scarring its surface. Ancient mankind witnessed a tremendous lightning bolt, symbolized by the sword of Arthur, strike the planet and scar its surface. As the discharge scoured the surface of Mars, it gouged out rock and soil, sending it into the atmosphere and in some cases into space. This was the blood gushing from the giant's wound. The scar is still visible today. It is called Valles Marineris. The beheadings of Goliath and Laban were not the simple disposing of an enemy. They were ritual executions. Both David and Nephi were commanded or constrained by God to take the lives of their victims and to do so by decapitation. David openly proclaimed that he intended to cut off Goliath's head and that the Lord had promised him that Goliath would be delivered into his hands for that very purpose. Nephi preferred not to take Laban's life, but was told 3 separate times to kill him. When he finally relented, Nephi smote off the head of Laban in direct obedience to the voice of the Spirit. The Spirit had directed Nephi to cut off Laban's head. Beheading as a form of capital punishment has a long and extensive history. In fact, the very term capital punishment refers to death by beheading. Like all ancient forms of capital punishment, beheading was performed in imitation of a heavenly precedent. The head of Goliath was cut off by David in imitation of the decapitation of the giant by the hero. So too was Laban. The principle, as in all things in ancient sacred culture, was as above, so below. The Lord uses the same principle in governing his kingdom on earth. The hero beheaded the giant or monster who threatened the sacred kingdom. In like manner, the heroes David and Nephi beheaded Goliath and Laban as the required execution for a usurper who attempted to seize power or defy the kingdom of God on earth.